So I want you to picture a thriving 18th century South American city.
Hmm.
You're walking down this bustling cobblestone street. There are merchants selling goods, artisans working in open-air shops,
Right.
domestic workers moving between these really grand colonial houses. And as you look around, you realize that nearly half the people you pass are of African descent.
Which is a massive portion of the population.
Exactly. I mean, in some of the surrounding provinces, that number is actually even higher.
Yeah.
It's just a demographic reality that's undeniable, right? It's visually, culturally, and economically foundational to the entire region.
Absolutely.
But now, jump in a time machine today, you walk those exact same streets, and the government and the history books tell you that this entire population just vanished.
Just poof, gone.
Right, poof, naturally died out, no tragedy, no foul play, just, an organic disappearance, leaving behind this entirely white nation.
Which is quite the story.
It is. So today we're looking at how a country successfully gaslit the world, about half of its population, and how modern DNA just caught them in the lie.
Yeah, it's arguably one of the most comprehensive and successful campaigns of demographic engineering in modern history.
Welcome to Today in the Hypothesis. Our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a massive, multidisciplinary investigation into the ideological, cultural, and genetic erasure of Afro-Argentines.
Because the narrative that was exported to the rest of the world for, well, over a century was that Argentines simply descended from the ships.
Descended from the ships, right.
Yeah, that specific phrase was used to imply that the entire nation was forged by European immigrants arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
And we are basically looking at a story that completely rewrites the baseline for a modern nation.
We really are. And to do that, we are synthesizing an incredible stack of sources for you today.
Which are just fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. We're pulling from colonial demographic censuses, 19th century constitutional legislation, and municipal civil registries.
And some literature too, right?
Yes. We are also analyzing foundational literary epics from the region, and finally, looking at cutting-edge genomic admixture studies.
So through all these different lenses, a very clear picture emerges, right? A population of that size doesn't just fade away naturally.
No, they definitely do not. They were subjected to a deliberate, deeply systemic, socio-political project.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start by just looking at the map and the raw numbers because, before we can understand how a population was erased, we really have to understand what the baseline actually looked like.
That makes sense.
When we say colonial era, what time frame and what geography are we actually talking about here?
So we are focusing primarily on the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata.
Okay.
This was a massive colonial administrative district established by the Spanish crown late in the game in 1776.
Right.
It encompassed what is today Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. And Buenos Aires was its capital and its primary port.
Wow, so a huge area.
Massive. And the numbers of enslaved Africans brought into this territory are just staggering, especially when you consider the overall population size of the region at the time.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, between 1680 and 1777, historical shipping records show at least 40,000 enslaved people were brought into the region.
Wait, 40,000? That's nearly a century of continuous human trafficking.
Yeah, and the pace only accelerated for there. Between 1777 and 1812, another 70,000 landed in the ports of Buenos Aires and Montevideo.
Oh my God.
And keep in mind, those are just the official documented arrivals through the primary ports. There was also a massive, undocumented overland trafficking network bringing people in from neighboring Brazil.
So the real number is likely much higher.
Much higher, yeah.
Do the historical records give us a sense of who these people were? I mean, when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, it's often treated as this monolith, but we're talking about highly distinct, diverse cultures here.
Right, and the demographic research is actually quite specific on this. A significant portion of the enslaved individuals brought directly from sub-Saharan Africa during this period belonged to ethnic groups that spoke Bantu languages.
Okay.
We are looking at roughly 22% coming from territories that today make up Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Republic of the Congo.
Got it.
These were predominantly Bakongo and Mbundu peoples. And this linguistic and cultural background becomes, well, incredibly important later when we look at how they organized and communicated underground.
Now, when I think of the economics of slavery in the Americas, my mind immediately goes to those massive agricultural engines, like the sugar plantations in Brazil or the cotton fields in the American South.
Right, the typical plantation model.
Exactly. Was the viceroyalty operating on that same kind of model?
That is a really crucial distinction to make. The territory that would become Argentina did not have a massive export-driven plantation economy. Yeah, the climate and the colonial focus just weren't geared toward vast sugar or cotton empires. So because of that economic reality, the labor dynamic was completely different.
How so?
Most enslaved people were utilized in urban environments. They were domestic workers, artisans, blacksmiths, bakers.
Okay, so highly integrated.
Exactly. In the more rural interior provinces, they worked on ranches, handling livestock and agriculture, but on a much smaller, localized scale.
Which means they weren't isolated on massive estates miles away from the city centers. They were deeply, fundamentally integrated into the day-to-day fabric of civic life.
They absolutely were.
If you were walking through a city, they were the people building the infrastructure and basically running the local economy.
Yeah, and the 1778 Vertes census captures this perfectly.
Oh, let's hear the census numbers.
So in Santiago del Estero, which is a major hub for agricultural and domestic labor, Afro-descendants accounted for over half the total population.
Over half.
Over half. In San Miguel de Tucumán, another key region for rural and artisan work, they were nearly half. Cordoba, which was this massive Jesuit economic center and a junction for all the colonial trade routes. Again, nearly 50%.
That's incredible.
And in urban Buenos Aires, by the late 1700s, they made up 40% of the city.
Those numbers paint an undeniable picture. This is a society where Afro-descendants were a majority, or at least a near majority, in key economic zones.
Without a doubt.
So how on earth do we get from 50% of the population to the modern textbooks claiming 0%?
That is the big question.
Right, because if you look at the traditional Argentine history curriculum that was taught for decades, they don't say the government erased them.
No, they point to a very specific set of historical tragedies. They claim it was a natural demographic collapse.
Historians have a name for this, right?
Yeah, historians refer to these as the extinction myths.
Extinction myths.
Right. The state needed an alibi for the demographic shift, so they relied heavily on two major external shocks, war and disease.
Okay, let's break those down. War is the first one.
Yeah, the first pillar of the myth was military conscription. The narrative argued that black men were drafted at disproportionately high rates during a brutal series of conflicts.
Like which conflicts?
You had the Wars of Independence starting in 1810, decades of internal civil wars between provincial warlords, and culminating in the War of the Triple Alliance in the 1860s.
Which was an incredibly bloody conflict against Paraguay.
Extremely bloody, yes.
So the narrative basically claims they were used as cannon fodder.
And that was the official line. The history book suggested that the Afro-Argentine male population was essentially wiped out on the battlefield.
Leaving the women behind?
Exactly, leaving the women with no choice but to marry incoming European immigrants, thus diluting the population organically.
And the second pillar of this extinction myth is public health, right?
Yes, the textbooks leaned heavily on devastating disease outbreaks.
Like what?
Specifically, the cholera epidemics of the 1860s, and most famously, the yellow fever epidemic of 1871 in Buenos Aires.
Ah.
The historical claim has long been that this epidemic swept through the impoverished southern quarters of the city neighborhoods, like San Telmo and Montserrat, and selectively decimated the black population living there.
Wait, disease and war are terrible, obviously, but they rarely wipe out a specific demographic with surgical precision while leaving the rest of the society relatively intact.
Right. It doesn't really make sense when you think about it.
I mean, how does a mosquito carrying yellow fever know the ancestry of the person it's biting?
It doesn't.
And were Afro-Argentines somehow the only ones fighting on these battlefields? This sounds like a really convenient alibi for a crime.
And that skepticism is exactly what drove modern demographers and historians to dig back into the primary archives.
And what did they find?
Well, when you look at the actual data, the extinction myths completely fall apart.
Let's hear it. Look at the military records first.
Okay, so it is true that Afro-Argentines were heavily conscripted. They served in segregated battalions and saw heavy combat.
Right.
But they did not make up the absolute majority of the combatants.
Okay.
Furthermore, When historians analyzed the casualty rates, they found that the mortality for black soldiers did not differ in any statistically significant way from the mortality rates of indigenous soldiers or poor white soldiers in the lower ranks.
Wow.
War is a meat grinder, but it didn't selectively erase one specific race of men from the continent.
So the cannon fodder argument is basically a vast overstatement designed to explain away missing census data.
Exactly.
What about the yellow fever epidemic?
Epidemiological analyses of the 1871 outbreak completely dismantle that myth as well.
Really?
Yeah, by cross-referencing death certificates with residential data, researchers discovered that the disease did not target the traditional black neighborhood specifically.
Oh, wow.
In fact, the highest mortality rates were concentrated in the conventillos.
Wait, what were the conventillos?
They were large colonial-style mansions that had been abandoned by the wealthy elite during the earlier cholera outbreaks.
Okay, so they were empty.
For a time, yeah. But then these mansions were chopped up and converted into incredibly dense, poorly ventilated tenement housing.
Sounds like a recipe for disease.
It was. Dozens of families would share a single courtyard and a single latrine. And in 1871, the people packed into those specific tenements were overwhelmingly the newly arrived European immigrants.
Oh, I see.
They were the ones dying at the most catastrophic rates, not specifically the established Afro-Argentine communities.
So the state takes these genuine historical tragedies, a brutal war, and a terrifying epidemic, and essentially hijacks them.
That's a good way to put it.
They weaponized the trauma to explain away a demographic shift that was actually the result of systemic social displacement.
It was a highly convenient alibi, yeah. It allowed the government to repackage structural exclusion into a narrative of tragic but entirely natural inevitability.
Right. But if nature, disease, and war didn't magically erase half the population of these cities, we have to look at who actually had the motive and the means to do it.
And all the evidence points directly to the intellectual architects of the Argentine state itself.
Our sources use a specific term for this, right? Blanqueamiento, or whitening.
Yes, blanqueamiento.
Can you break down what that actual ideology was? Because it wasn't just a casual preference, right? It was a comprehensive philosophy.
To really understand blanqueamiento, we have to step into the mindset of the 19th century intellectual elite.
Okay, put me in their shoes.
This was an era deeply influenced by European philosophical movements, specifically positivism and early forms of social Darwinism.
Let's pause there for a second, because for someone who hasn't taken a political science class in a while, what exactly are positivist racial hierarchies and social Darwinism in this context? Like, what did these leaders actually believe?
So, positivism, broadly speaking, was a philosophical system that believed society should be organized and governed by strict scientific principles and observable data, rejecting theology or mysticism.
Sounds reasonable on paper.
Right. But in the 19th century, this pursuit of science became heavily entangled with racial theories.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Social Darwinism took Charles Darwin's biological concept of survival of the fittest and incorrectly applied it to human societies and races.
Ah, okay.
The elite statesmen building the modern Argentine Republic looked at these theories and concluded that national progress, industrialization, and civilization were biologically and culturally linked to whiteness.
Wait, so they literally believed that to have a modern, functioning economy like France or England, they fundamentally needed the biological makeup of France or England.
That was their core conviction. They viewed indigenous and Afro-descendant populations as inherently barbaric or backward, basically an anchor weighing down the nation's potential.
That is incredibly dark.
It is. They fundamentally believed that a modern nation had to be a white nation.
And one of the most vocal proponents of this was Juan Bautista Alberti.
Yes, Alberti is a massive figure in Argentine history.
He's essentially the principal intellectual architect of their 1853 constitution. And he coined a phrase that became a national mantra, gobernar es poblar.
To govern is to populate.
Right. But reading the sources, it's clear he didn't just mean encouraging local families to have more children.
Not at all. Alberti explicitly argued that the state had to actively replace its existing population.
Replace them?
Yes. He believed that the cultural and genetic traits of the local non-white populations were incompatible with Republican governance.
Wow.
He didn't just want population growth, he wanted demographic replacement via European immigration.
And this wasn't just some philosophy debated in fancy salons. It became the literal law of the land.
It did.
Because Alberti's logic was copy-pasted directly into Article 25 of the 1853 Constitution.
That's right.
That article legally instructed the federal government to actively promote European immigration. It specifically prohibited placing any taxes or restrictions on foreigners who were arriving to cultivate land, improve industries, or introduce sciences.
And the scale of what that single constitutional mandate achieved is just mind-boggling.
Give me the numbers.
By legally opening the floodgates and actively incentivizing European arrivals, the state facilitated the immigration of approximately 6.6 million Europeans between 1857 and 1950.
6.6 million.
Yeah, it was one of the largest mass migrations in modern history, designed explicitly to permanently alter the country's demographic balance.
They were diluting the visible presence of non-white populations by sheer mathematical volume.
Exactly.
It's demographic engineering on a continental scale. But bringing people in was only half the equation, right?
The other half was erasing the history of the people who were already there.
And that brings us to Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, who served as president from 1868 to 1874.
Sarmiento is a huge figure here.
He wrote a book in 1845 that basically serves as the foundational text for Argentine political thought. It's called Facundo, Civilization y Barbarie.
Facundo is essential reading for understanding this era. Sarmiento frames the entire history and future of Argentina as an existential, almost cosmic struggle.
Civilization versus barbarism.
Exactly. On one side is European civilization, represented by the cities, education, and white culture. And on the other side is rural barbarism, represented by the local gauchos, the indigenous tribes, and the Afro-descendant populations.
And once he becomes president, he has the power to bake that worldview into the minds of the next generation.
He really does.
Under his administration, the entire educational curriculum was redesigned. They completely omitted the historical contributions, the labor, and the military service of Afro-Argentines from the textbooks.
And the power of educational erasure cannot be overstated. It cultivates a collective, multi-generational amnesia.
Right, because if you stop teaching children about a population's existence, within just a few decades, society genuinely forgets they were ever there.
Exactly. People begin to accept the extinction myths because they have no educational foundation to question them.
And Sarmiento's personal views were just uncompromising.
Oh, yeah. The sources highlight an 1848 diary entry he wrote while traveling in the United States.
What did he say?
He observed the racial tensions there and wrote, quote, "Slavery is a parasite. What is to be done with such blacks, hated by the white race?"
Wow, that's just blatantly racist.
The intent at the highest levels of government was always removal. If not physical removal, then entirely narrative removal.
You can really see this racism playing out in real time, affecting prominent historical figures who are just trying to help build the nation.
Oh, absolutely.
Take Bernardo de Monteagudo. He was a brilliant, highly influential politician during the Wars for Independence. But in 1812, he was blocked from joining the first triumvirate, which was the executive governing body at the time.
And the reason given was completely absurd.
Yeah, the official reason given was his questionable mother.
Which is a thinly veiled derogatory reference to his African ancestry.
Right. Or consider Bernardino Rivadavia, who actually became the very first president of Argentina in 1826.
Yeah.
Despite holding the highest office in the land, he faced relentless structural racism. His political opponents aggressively mocked his physical appearance and derogatorily nicknamed him Dr. Chocolate.
It's terrible. He was the head of state, yet he was constantly undermined by an elite class that viewed his African heritage as a stain on the office.
That deep-seated elite protectionism is also glaringly obvious when you look at how they handled the abolition of slavery.
This is a really telling part of the history.
A lot of traditional history points to the Assembly of the Year 13th in 1813. They passed a law called the Freedom of Wombs.
Right.
The law decreed that any child born to an enslaved mother from that day forward was automatically born free. Now, on the surface, if I'm reading a textbook, that sounds incredibly progressive for 1813.
It sounds progressive until you look at the mechanics of what it actually did.
What did it actually do?
Well, the Freedom of Wombs law did not liberate a single person who was currently enslaved.
Wait, really?
Yeah. If you were enslaved on Tuesday, you were still enslaved on Wednesday after the law passed. Unconditional, complete abolition of slavery in Argentina was actively delayed for another 40 years.
40 years.
It wasn't formally abolished until that 1853 Constitution.
Why wait 40 years? I mean, if the philosophical tide was turning toward freedom, why keep an entire generation in chains?
Follow the money.
Ah, of course.
The state leaders prioritized the property rights and the economic stability of the elite white slaveholders over the fundamental human rights of the enslaved population.
So they basically phased it out slowly.
Exactly. The transition to freedom was systematically dragged out so that the white capital class wouldn't suffer a sudden loss of their free labor force. They wanted the optics of progressive liberalism without paying the immediate economic cost.
It's just a staggering level of hypocrisy, and here's where it gets really interesting. The psychological scale of this project is what truly stands out.
It's massive.
It wasn't just physical displacement. It was a mass gaslighting project executed over decades through textbooks, laws, and political rhetoric.
Yeah, and it was so successful that it persisted for over a century.
I mean, you can fast forward all the way to 1993. The president of Argentina at the time, Carlos Menem, is giving a public address at Maastricht University in the Netherlands.
Right, I remember this.
A foreign journalist asks him a question regarding the Afro-descendant population, and Menem literally says on the record, quote, "In Argentina, blacks do not exist. That is a Brazilian problem."
Which is just an unbelievable statement.
And he later repeated the exact same sentiment during a visit to Howard University in the United States.
When a modern head of state stands at a podium and delivers a line like that, they aren't just misspeaking.
No.
They are reciting a script that took 150 years of deliberate policy to write. The belief in a purely white Argentina was so deeply embedded in the institutional DNA that it was treated as an unquestionable fact.
But knowing the ideology is one thing, the logistics are another entirely. How does a government actually execute a demographic erasure of this magnitude without resorting to mass violence, deportation, or concentration camps?
The sources reveal one of the most insidious, quiet tools of statecraft ever used. The census taker's pen.
The census taker's pen.
Yes, it's a process the historical research refers to as lightening on paper.
Lightening on paper.
You have to remember, following independence from Spain, the new republic inherited the colonial sistema de castas, or caste system.
What exactly was the sistema de castas?
It was an incredibly complex, hyper-specific racial classification system designed by the Spanish Empire to enforce social hierarchy.
Okay.
It didn't just have categories for white, black, and Indian. It had dozens of classifications based on the exact fractional mixture of a person's heritage.
Oh, wow.
You had mestizos, which meant European and indigenous, mulattoes for European and African, Zambos for African and indigenous, and many, many more.
That is extremely detailed.
And your classification dictated everything, what jobs you could hold, who you could marry, and how much tax you paid.
So when Argentina becomes an independent republic, they start dismantling this system, which in theory aligns with the ideals of a new egalitarian democracy.
In theory, yes.
But that's not what actually happened, is it?
Exactly the opposite. Instead of moving toward a post-racial society where everyone was simply an Argentine citizen, the local authorities and census takers started weaponizing new terminology.
How so?
They began using linguistic reclassification to actively mask African ancestry, absorbing Afro-descendants into broader, racially ambiguous categories that sounded less black.
Let me get this straight. It's basically like an algorithm shadow banning a demographic on a social media platform.
That's a great analogy.
Right. The people are still using the platform. They're still walking the streets and living their lives, but the system's underlying code has been rewritten so they no longer appear in the official metrics or the search results.
That is exactly what happened.
Our sources highlight 3 specific terms that were used to execute this shadow ban. Let's look at the first one. Pardo or parta.
Right. So historically, during the rigid colonial era, Pardo was a specific designation for individuals of mixed African and European or African and indigenous ancestry. But as we move into the 19th century, local administrators, particularly in interior cities like Cordoba, started using Pardo as a massive administrative catch-all.
A catch-all for what?
It ceased to be a specific ancestral marker and just became a generic term for the non-white laboring class.
Oh, I see.
Census takers lumped indigenous people, formerly categorized free blacks, and mixed-race individuals all under the umbrella of Pardo. By doing so, they diluted the specificity of the African presence in the data.
The second term is even more overt in its visual manipulation. Trigueño or trigueña.
Yes.
Which literally translates to wheat-colored. How is this used in the registries?
Trigueña was widely adopted as a polite euphemism. It was a descriptive term used by civil authorities to classify individuals with a darker complexion.
Okay, sounds descriptive enough.
But the crucial shift is that by categorizing someone as wheat-colored, the state effectively stripped them of any explicit African or indigenous classification on their official records. It replaced an ancestral historical reality with a vague phenotypic description.
And the third term is fascinating because of its modern usage. Morocho or morocha.
Yeah, this one is very interesting.
Today, if you visit Argentina, this is a very common, generally non-offensive colloquialism used to describe someone with dark hair or a tanned complexion. But historically, it was a profound tool for erasure.
The term evolved to conflate several completely distinct demographic groups into one.
Like who?
If you had descendants of Southern European Mediterranean immigrants with olive skin, indigenous peoples, and Afro-descendants, the state simply categorized all of them under the vague umbrella of Morocha.
Just lump them all together.
Exactly. This allowed state statisticians to look at the macro data, declare a virtual absence of people classified as Black, and conveniently ignore the fact that a vast portion of these Morochos carried significant African ancestral markers.
To really understand the mechanics of this, we can look at how it affected individual human lives in the municipal archives of Córdoba and Buenos Aires. Historians literally track the paperwork of specific people over decades to see how the state altered their identities.
It's remarkable research.
Take the story of two sisters, Francisca and Magdalena.
Their paperwork is a perfect example of this administrative drift. In a census taken in 1813, both sisters are officially recorded as free Indians.
Okay.
But just 9 years later, in the 1822 registry, the exact same women are reclassified by a different census taker as free partis.
Wait, really? Their heritage hadn't changed?
Their actual heritage hadn't changed at all, but the state was consolidating its non-white population into manageable, ambiguous categories.
Or look at Josefa Rodriguez. Her journey through the paperwork shows how upward mobility was tied to racial reclassification.
Yes.
In 1813, she is starkly classified as a Negro slave. But by 1822, she has managed to secure her manumission. She is a free woman.
Which is incredible.
It is. But her freedom is accompanied by a shift in the registry. She is now recorded as a free parda. She moves out of the Black category and into the ambiguous one.
Exactly.
And my absolute favorite example from the text is Teresa Sotelo.
Oh, Teresa's trajectory is just remarkable. At her birth, the local registry simply lifts her condition as enslaved.
Yes, enslaved.
Right. Decades later, in a 1778 record, her classification shifts. She is recorded as a mestiza.
Which implies indigenous and European mix, completely ignoring the African heritage entirely.
Exactly. And then by 1811, after she relocates geographically and manages to marry up the social ladder, official documents record her with the honorific title Doña.
Wow, Doña.
Her enslaved African origins have been completely legally scrubbed from her public identity.
So we see these individual cases, but what is the macro effect of all these census takers making these seemingly small adjustments over decades?
The macro effect is total statistical erasure. By 1840, which notably was the date of the very last city census in Córdoba before it joined the Argentine Confederation, racial categories were eliminated entirely from official records.
They just stopped tracking it.
The state simply decided to start counting race.
Now, on the surface, a modern listener might think, well, isn't that a good thing? Isn't a colorblind census the goal of an equal society?
It is a devastatingly effective trap. It sounds like equality, but it operates as permanent erasure.
Because the data was already messed up.
Exactly, because the entire population had already been preemptively lightened on paper reclassified into Pardo, Trigueño, and Morocho. When the government finally stopped tracking race, they froze that falsified data into the permanent historical record.
So when those 6.6 million European immigrants started flooding into the country after 1850, the baseline demographic data they were merging with was already fundamentally skewed.
Precisely. The state altered the starting line of the demographic data before the massive waves of European immigration even arrived.
Wow.
The narrative of the White Nation was built on a foundation of falsified paperwork.
Now, it is incredibly easy for us to sit here looking at these old census records and view the Afro-Argentine population as passive victims.
Yeah, it's a common misconception.
Right. It's easy to see them as just ink on a page, being manipulated by elite politicians and racist bureaucrats. But the historical research explicitly warns us against that kind of thinking.
Because they weren't passive at all.
Exactly. Because if you are living in a system where the rules are fundamentally rigged against your survival, you don't just sit there. You figure out how to game the system.
Yes.
And the evidence shows that people, specifically Afro-descendant women, played a massive active role in this demographic shift as a survival strategy.
The pivot to understanding agency from below is really one of the most exciting developments in this historiography.
I agree.
Groundbreaking work focusing on Córdoba during the late colonial and early Republican periods reveals that women of African descent were brilliant, strategic navigators of a highly oppressive legal framework.
They really were.
They understood the legal and social algorithms of their era perfectly, and they actively negotiated their family's racial status as a profound survival strategy.
To understand how they did this, we have to look at how Spanish colonial society defined identity. Your legal status, your honor, your privileges in society, a concept they called calidad, was highly gendered.
Very much so.
The legal status of a child followed the mother. If a father was a free white man, but the mother was enslaved, the child was born enslaved.
Right.
But if the mother was free, the child was free, regardless of the father. So securing a different, lighter racial classification wasn't just about trying to fit in or gain social prestige.
No, it was literal survival.
It was a matter of intergenerational freedom. It determined whether your children could be bought and sold.
And because the stakes were that high, women utilized bold legal strategies. One of the primary tools was ancestry contestation.
What does that mean?
We see numerous cases in the archives where enslaved women would file civil and ecclesiastical lawsuits, actively claiming that they had maternal Indian ancestry.
Why specifically claim Indian ancestry? I mean, why not just claim they were free?
Because the Spanish colonial legal framework treated indigenous populations and African populations very differently.
Okay.
While indigenous people were heavily exploited and forced into labor systems like the encomienda, they were technically considered vassals of the crown. Therefore, being legally classified as Indian often precluded you from being held in absolute chattel slavery, which was reserved for people of African descent.
So these women were deliberately filing paperwork to legally brown their identities. They were using the colonizers' own racist hierarchy against them.
Yes.
Looking for the legal loopholes that would provide a trapdoor out of chattel slavery for themselves and their children.
Exactly. They weaponized the bureaucracy.
That is brilliant.
Another major strategy involved intimate alliances and concubinage. Women of African descent frequently forged domestic and sexual relationships with elite Spanish men or incoming white European immigrants.
And the archives give us this incredible vivid story of an enslaved woman in Córdoba named Bernabella.
Oh, Bernabella's story is fascinating.
Walk us through it. How did she navigate this?
So Bernabella managed to leverage a relationship with an elite Spanish-born priest.
Okay.
Through this alliance, she wasn't just a hidden concubine. She effectively became the manager of his entire household.
Wow.
She took on the public title of a señora. She began wearing fine silks and gold jewelry and public items that were strictly legally prohibited for enslaved women to wear by the sumptuary laws of the time.
So she's just blatantly defying the law.
Yes. And by elevating her own public status and living under the protection of this elite figure, she completely altered the social and legal trajectory of her children, pulling them out of the lower castes.
It's like she figured out how to card count in a rigged casino.
That's a great way to put it.
She knew the house always won on paper, so she manipulated the social dynamics to secure a future for her bloodline. And this concept scales up massively when we look at the broader demographic trends, specifically something the research calls matrimonial whitening. We talked earlier about those 6.6 million European immigrants arriving. What did the demographics of those boats actually look like?
It was overwhelmingly male.
Yeah.
The immigration waves consisted largely of single men looking for work in the ports, the fields, and the railways.
Okay.
This created a severe gender imbalance in the population of the coastal cities. At the exact same time, within the Afro-Argentine community, there was a noticeable shortage of black males.
Due to the decades of heavy military conscription and the harsh labor conditions we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
So you have massive tenement houses, the conventios, packed with young, single European men from Italy and Spain, living right alongside established communities of free Afro-descendant women.
And the inevitable demographic result was widespread, sustained intermarriage. Free women of African descent frequently married white European men.
Right.
And over successive generations, the children of these unions gradually acquired the legal, social, and eventually phenotypic privileges of whiteness.
So they blended in.
Yes. And what this proves is a powerful paradox. The project of blanqueamiento wasn't just a top-down oppression forced upon a passive populace.
No.
It was actually facilitated by bottom-up survival strategies. The racist state wanted the black population gone. The Afro-Argentine mothers wanted their children to survive and thrive.
Wow.
The resulting genetic admixture achieved the state's goal of visible whitening, but it also achieved the women's goal of invisible genetic survival.
It is just a profound realization about human resilience. But if so many people were assimilating into the broader white population through marriage and legal maneuvering, what happened to the core cultural community?
Well, you don't just erase a culture of that size overnight.
Right. I mean, the music, the religion, the social networks. For the people who didn't marry into European families, where did they go?
They went underground. The economic and spiritual survival of the Afro-Argentine community in the 19th century is an absolute masterclass in subversion.
A masterclass.
Yes. While the state was actively writing them out of the educational textbooks and census forms, the community was busy building incredibly robust, self-organized institutions right under the noses of the authorities.
The research highlights that in the first half of the 19th century, there were more than 50 distinct African nations, or naciones, operating just within the city limits of Buenos Aires. And they maintained names that tied them directly back to their roots across the Atlantic. Groups like the Ogunga, the Kisama, the Moravi, the Monyolo, the Minanago, and the Sabalu.
To the white elite of Buenos Aires looking in from the outside, these gatherings just looked like loud, colorful, but ultimately harmless weekend entertainment.
Right.
The elites referred to these gatherings locally as candoms, or tangos terms, initially used just to describe the rhythmic dancing and drumming.
But the dancing was essentially a cover story, wasn't it?
A brilliant cover story. These groups were officially registered and licensed by the government as Asociaciones Africanas, or African associations.
Yep.
The state thought they were licensing dance trips. But internally, these associations functioned as highly sophisticated mutual aid societies.
Mutual aid society, yes.
They were the economic engines of the underground black community. Members paid dues, and they pooled this capital for critical community needs.
What kind of needs?
They used the funds to purchase the freedom of enslaved members, a process called manumission. They funded the education and trade apprenticeships of emancipated slaves.
Oh, wow.
They even pooled enough capital to buy physical real estate in the city, purchasing lots to build meeting houses that served as community temples, social clubs, and sanctuaries.
The financial discipline required to pull that off in an actively hostile environment is just staggering. And the sources note something incredibly poignant about their budgets.
Yes, regarding funerals.
Right. Approximately half of their total pooled funds were systematically allocated to funeral rites, burials, and the memory of the dead.
Half their funds.
It shows this profound, unbroken spiritual and material commitment to ancestral preservation. Even if the state wouldn't remember them, the nation would.
Naturally, the government became suspicious of these organized, well-funded black institutions and tried to control them.
I bet they did.
The state mandated that internal elections for the leaders of these nations, the title was the Padre de Nación, had to be strictly overseen by the police.
Of course.
It created a complex patronage system where the leaders had to play politics with the local police chiefs. But despite this interference, powerful black leaders emerged and held immense influence.
Like who?
For example, Joaquin Arriola successfully led the nation Benguela for 30 consecutive years until 1864, navigating the oppressive state bureaucracy while maintaining his community's cohesion.
And as we move into the 20th century, we also have to talk about a completely distinct wave of black immigration that challenges the state's narrative of a purely white European influx.
Oh, definitely.
I'm talking about the Cape Verdean immigration wave.
This is a fascinating chapter. Starting in the late 19th century and seeing major peaks between 1927 and 1933, and again after 1946, thousands of people fled droughts, famines, and colonial hardship in Cape Verde.
Which is an archipelago off the coast of West Africa.
Exactly. We are talking about an estimated 12,000 to 15,000 Cape Verdeans and their descendants arriving in Argentina.
And because of where they came from, they arrived with a very specific, highly valuable skill set.
Yes, they were expert mariners and sailors. When they arrived, they didn't settle in the rural interior. They settled directly in the major industrial port cities, places like Rosario, Buenos Aires, Bahia Blanca, and Dock Sud.
Okay.
And they dominated the maritime labor force. The data shows that up to 95% of them secured employment in the maritime industries.
Wow.
They worked in the military navy, the merchant navy, the fluvial fleet navigating the rivers, and they were essential labor in the state-owned YPF shipyards.
So they were everywhere on the water.
Yes, they maintained a highly visible, active, black working-class presence right in the middle of the 20th century, completely running counter to the official narrative that black people no longer existed in Argentina.
So economically, through the mutual aid societies and the maritime industries, they maintained a foothold. But what about spiritually? Because religion is often where the deepest, most resilient cultural roots are preserved when a community is under threat.
That brings us to the powerful phenomenon of religious syncretism, and specifically the veneration of San Baltasar.
San Baltasar.
Yes, despite all the state-sponsored efforts to erase their presence, Afro-Argentine communities maintain their spiritual lineages by blending their traditional African beliefs with the dominant Catholicism of the state.
Okay.
San Baltasar, also known locally as Santo Baltasar or Santo Camba, which translates to black in the local Guarani language, is a prime example. He is a folk saint, adapted from the biblical narrative of Balthasar, one of the three wise men who visited the infant Jesus.
But to be clear, he was never formally canonized by the Vatican, right?
No, never.
So this isn't an official Catholic mandate. This is a popular, grassroots, paraliturgical movement created by the people.
Correct. Historically, the Spanish colonial authorities gave enslaved Africans a single day of rest during the year, which fell on January 6th, the Catholic feast of the Epiphany.
Ah.
The Afro-descendant community transformed this day into what became known as the Pascua de los Negros, or the Black Easter.
The Black Easter.
Yes. The African nations we discussed earlier established religious brotherhoods, like the Cofradía de San Baltasar y Ánimas in Buenos Aires, specifically to preserve African spiritual structures under a Catholic facade that the authorities would tolerate.
While those brotherhoods were largely suppressed and pushed out of Buenos Aires by the aggressive urban whitening policies of the late 1800s, the cult of San Baltasar didn't die.
No, it didn't.
It survived by moving. It thrived in the littoral region, specifically in the northeastern province of Corrientes. And the research points out that it survived there for two main reasons: geography and cultural blending.
Geography is key here.
Right. Corrientes is situated between the massive Paraná and Uruguay rivers. For a long time, it was highly inaccessible from the capital.
A natural barrier.
Exactly. That geographic isolation provided a shield. The aggressive whitening policies and the European demographic influx out of Buenos Aires simply couldn't reach them as effectively.
And culturally, they integrated their African drumming traditions with local Guarani indigenous culture and folk Catholicism.
Right.
If you go to the annual festival on January 6th today, particularly in the Cambacua neighborhood of Corrientes, you witness this incredible survival of culture.
Well, that happens there.
Devotees dance to traditional candombe rhythms and play the charanda, or zemba. This is a massive, traditional, two-sided drum carved entirely from a single tree trunk. It is a direct acoustic link to the African continent.
What genuinely moves me about this is the sheer durability of the practice.
It's amazing.
The Festival of San Baltasar was even explicitly banned by the brutal military dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 1983. The regime tried to crush it, but it survived. It lived on.
It did.
It proves that while Afro-Argentines might have been scrubbed from the official monuments and the textbooks of the capital city, they maintained fiercely independent cultural spaces in the margins. The roots were simply too deep to be pulled up entirely.
And here is a universal truth about history. When you have a tension that deep, a powerful state apparatus trying desperately to erase a people, and a people quietly refusing to be fully erased, that tension cannot just be contained in historical archives and census forms.
No.
It inevitably bleeds out into the broader culture, and in Argentina, it bled directly into the definitive literature of the nation.
Which brings us to a fascinating analysis of the subaltern voice in national literature. If you study Argentine literature, the absolute cornerstone, the foundational text of national identity, is a massive epic poem written by José Hernández called El Gaucho Martín Fierro.
It is the defining text.
It was published in two parts. The first part, La Ida, in 1872, and the sequel, La Vuelta, in 1879. Now, any reader engaging with this text immediately notices the violent racial dynamics at play.
It is a complex text because the protagonist, Martín Fierro himself, is a marginalized figure. He is a non-white Criollo gaucho, a cowboy of the plains.
Okay.
He is depicted as fighting against the unjust military draft, fighting the corrupt state, living a hard life on the frontier. He became the romanticized symbol of the rugged, independent, authentic Argentine spirit, standing in opposition to the European-focused Unitarian elite in Buenos Aires.
Wait, time out. Just to clarify the politics of the time, for someone who doesn't know Argentine history, who are the Unitarian elite, what is the conflict there?
Right. So throughout the 19th century, Argentina was torn apart by a conflict between two main political factions, the Unitarians and the Federalists.
Okay.
The Unitarians were primarily based in the port city of Buenos Aires. They were the wealthy elite, the intellectuals like Sarmiento, who wanted a highly centralized government and believed that Argentina needed to adopt European culture, trade, and demographics to be civilized.
Got it.
The Federalists were based in the rural interior provinces. They wanted decentralized power, and their culture was rooted in the local traditions of the gauchos, the mestizos, and the Afro-descendants.
I see.
Martin Fierro is the ultimate symbol of that rural, non-European Federalist culture being crushed by the Unitarian state.
Thank you. That context is crucial. So Fierro is this marginalized hero, but Hernandez's narrative doesn't shy away from exposing the deep, violent racial animosities among the marginalized groups themselves.
No, it doesn't.
In the 1872 publication, La Ida, Fierro goes to a local dance at a rural tavern, a pulperia. He gets heavily drunk, arrogantly insults a black woman who is attending the dance, and then deliberately provokes her partner, a black man.
Right.
The confrontation escalates, and Fierro murders the black man in a brutal, graphic knife fight. It is a stark, ugly moment of racial violence enacted by the supposed national hero.
It is. But it's the sequel, La Vuelta, published 7 years later in 1879, where the ghost of the Afro-Argentine community truly haunts the text and demands accountability.
Yes, the climax of the book.
This occurs during the climax of the book, which features a legendary payada.
For those unfamiliar, a payada is essentially a high-stakes, improvised poetry battle. Two men sit across from each other with guitars, taking turns singing verses, philosophizing, and insulting each other in perfect rhythm and rhyme until one of them can't respond. It's a massive part of gaucho culture.
And in this climactic payada, Fierro sits down for a vocal duel with a character known only as El Moreno, which translates to the black singer.
The black singer.
Yes, Hernandez gives this character an incredible amount of agency. El Moreno uses his guitar and his poetry not just for a musical competition, but to assert deep intellectual and moral equality in a society that affords him none.
Right.
There is a famous, powerful line he sings during the duel. I also have something white, for I have white teeth. I know how to live among people without being looked down upon. He is demanding dignity and respect.
So why is this singing duel so important to our deep dive? Because El Moreno isn't just a random wandering musician who happened to challenge Fierro.
No, he's not.
During the intense back and forth of the duel, the dramatic reveal happens. El Moreno is the younger brother of the black man that Fierro murdered years ago in the first book.
Exactly.
He isn't sitting there for a trophy. He is there to demand familial justice. He is there to hold the national hero accountable for the black blood he spilled.
From an analytical standpoint, this payada functions as a profound counter-narrative to the state's project of erasure.
A counter-narrative.
Yes, the Unitarian elite in Buenos Aires desperately wanted to write black bodies completely out of the national landscape. But here, in the defining epic of the nation, Hernandez forces the audience to confront El Moreno.
Right.
He is portrayed as a powerful, articulate, grieving, and vengeful figure. He captures the lingering presence and the unresolved grievances of the entire Afro-Argentine community.
Wow.
The literary implication is clear. You cannot build a peaceful white nation if your defining national myth is forever haunted by the ghost of the black brother demanding justice.
It is undeniable literary proof of presence. We've looked at the massive colonial demographic data, we've explored the legal lawsuits of enslaved women, and we've analyzed the subtext of national literature.
We have.
But now we arrive at the absolute, undeniable smoking gun of this entire investigation. We are talking about molecular biology.
A science.
The DNA speaks, and it completely mathematically shatters the myth of extinction.
This is where contemporary science intersects with 19th century history in a truly undeniable way. In recent years, genomic admixture studies have looked incredibly closely at the modern Argentine population.
Okay.
Keep in mind, this is a population that has been told by its own government, its schools, and its media for a century that it is entirely homogeneously European.
Right.
And the molecular anthropology completely disproves the physical disappearance of Afro-Argentines.
Let's break down the mechanics of the DNA testing.
Yeah.
The studies use something called ancestry informative markers. These are specific variations in the human genome that are linked to particular geographic origins.
Yeah.
When they look at autosomal DNA, which is the DNA you inherit from all your ancestors combined, creating a kind of genetic soup, what do the numbers show for the modern Argentine population?
The autosomal DNA shows that modern Argentines possess a highly blended trihybrid genetic ancestry.
A trihybrid genetic ancestry.
Yes. On average, the national genetic pool is about 65% European, 31% Indigenous American, and roughly 4% African.
Okay.
Now, visually, 4% might sound like a small number, but the crucial point that geneticists make is that this 4% is widely and evenly distributed across individuals who look in the mirror and self-identify as entirely 100% white.
So the genes didn't vanish. They were just diluted and integrated into the broader population over millions of marriages.
Exactly.
But the data gets even more revealing and directly proves our historical research when you look at the mechanics of sex-biased mating patterns.
This is the fascinating part.
If you recalled the historical survival strategy of matrimonial whitening we discussed earlier, the millions of single European men marrying Indigenous and Afro-descendant women, the genetics prove that this is exactly what happened.
Yes, it does.
How does the DNA show that specific gender breakdown?
By comparing two specific unbroken genetic chains, patrilineal and matrilineal markers.
Okay, father and mother.
Right. If you look at the Y chromosome, which is passed exclusively from father to son, you find that up to 94% of male lineages in Argentina are of European origin.
94%.
Yes. The fathers, biologically speaking, were the men who came off the ships from Italy and Spain.
Wow.
But if you look at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively from mothers to all their children, you see a completely different biological reality. Over 54% of maternal lineages in Argentina are of Native American or African ancestry.
That is incredible. Over half the maternal lines of the entire country are non-European.
It perfectly, mathematically mirrors the demographic reality of a massive influx of single European men merging with the local women of color.
Furthermore, if you look at X chromosomal data, the African contribution jumps even higher, to about 9%.
Yes, it does.
The X chromosome is fascinating because it reflects maternal transmission pathways more heavily than general autosomal DNA, as men inherit their single X chromosome exclusively from their mothers.
Right.
This biological reality confirms that while phenotypic traits, the physical appearances like skin color or hair texture associated with African ancestry were largely lost due to successive generations of admixture, the genetic lineage never died out. It permanently survived.
You can falsify a census document, you can ban a traditional drum from the city square, you can rewrite an entire educational curriculum, but you cannot falsify a chromosome.
You cannot.
The state's ideological project of complete, pure whitening fundamentally failed at a cellular level. The genes of those African women who fought for survival in the colonial courts are permanently woven into the national fabric.
That is profound.
And the genetics also destroy the idea of a homogeneous nation geographically. The data shows that the Buenos Aires province, the capital region, is about 76% European in genetic ancestry.
Okay.
But if you travel to the northwest region of the country, it's only 33% European. The narrative of a purely white nation was always a projection of the coastal elite, not the reality of the interior.
Which leads us to a critical realization. This entire discussion we are having isn't just a deep dive into ancient history. The narratives established by Alberti and Sarmiento, the complex legacy of the census takers, the enduring myth of white Argentina, these forces are still actively shaping modern geopolitics and state policies today.
Absolutely. Looking at the sources for the modern era, it's fascinating to see how these historical themes are still completely active in today's policy debates.
Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, the data shows a clear continuation of this historical narrative regarding national identity. What modern actions do our sources highlight?
Looking at the current geopolitical landscape under the administration of President Javier Milei, our sources note a specific set of policy actions regarding race and historical memory.
Okay.
Domestically, the government has closed the National Institute Against Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Racism, commonly known by its acronym INADI.
Right.
By closing this overarching institute, the administration subsequently eliminated the Commission for the Historical Recognition of the Afro-Argentine Community.
And what was that commission's purpose?
This commission was the primary institutional space that had been created in recent years specifically to promote measures of recognition and repair for historically excluded Afro-descendants.
And the research points to actions on the international stage as well. In a recent United Nations General Assembly vote concerning a resolution that recognized chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade as crimes against humanity, and which called for international reparations, Argentina's voting record stood out significantly.
It did.
Out of the entire Global Assembly, Argentina was one of only 3 nations to vote against the measure, aligning their vote alongside the United States and Israel.
And just to be clear, from an objective analytical standpoint, observing these actions through the lens of our research, they align consistently with the long-standing historical state tradition we've been tracking for the past hour.
Yes. As a reminder, we are not taking sides here, but simply reporting on the geopolitical actions mentioned in our sources to show how these historical themes of national identity are still part of current policy debates.
Exactly. Since the 19th century philosophies of Alberti and Sarmiento, the Argentine state apparatus has consistently associated national progress and international posture with European alignment.
They have historically viewed the acknowledgement of racialized majorities, and certainly the concept of historical reparations, as incompatible with the projected national identity.
Right. The historical project of whitening continues to exert a profound gravitational pull on modern institutional decisions.
We have covered immense ground today. We started by visualizing the demographic reality of over 100,000 enslaved people building the economic foundations of a viceroyalty.
We traced how the intellectual architects of a new nation weaponized massive European immigration to build a civilized white society.
We watched how a population was shadow banned by census takers with a stroke of a pen, shifting categories to hide reality.
We explored the incredible, calculating agency of women hacking the legal system to save their families, the underground mutual aid societies masking their survival funds as dance troupes.
And the enduring rhythm of the charanda drum protecting the spirit of San Baltasar. We heard the ghost of El Moreno demanding justice in the nation's defining literature.
And finally, we saw the undeniable mathematical proof in the modern genome, the Y chromosomes from the ships and the mitochondrial DNA from the soil.
The overarching conclusion of the evidence is undeniable. The erasure of Afro-Argentines was an ideological and narrative success, but a physical and genetic failure.
They were meticulously written out of the history books, but they permanently wrote themselves into the very bloodline of the nation.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought. If an entire national identity, the fundamental way millions of people understand who they are and where they come from, can be artificially engineered over a century through careful laws, redacted textbooks, and manipulated paperwork, it makes you wonder. What parts of your country's history have been quietly reclassified into oblivion? Who wrote the baseline for your reality?
It is a profound question. Knowledge is only as reliable as the intent of the people who recorded it.
Thank you for joining us on this edition of Today in the Hypothesis. If you want to keep uncovering the hidden layers of our world and challenging the baselines of history, please subscribe and share this deep dive with someone who loves exploring massive historical paradoxes. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.